four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, announce the resurrection of Christ. Mark's account is the oldest of them, and his ending is rather odd. Did you notice that? Instead of the women running from the tomb, yelling to everyone who would listen, "He's alive! He's alive!" Mark says they fled in terror and amazement, for they were afraid. And let me just go on record by saying that's the last reaction that I want from you when you leave. Fear. Doesn't that seem like an odd ending to the Easter story? Doesn't that sound like an odd ending to Easter Day? Oh, I can just see it now. You leave here and you go to La Scala, or you go to Bravo's, or you go to a family member's home for Easter dinner. You're meeting other family members and you walk in. They take one look at you and ask, "What happened?" Because you have this awful look on your face, and the only thing that you can say is, "I went to church." That would not be good. Fear is an odd response to Easter. Now, let me say this. The women were going to anoint the body of Jesus on that day because they weren't able to do it when he was buried. It was the start of Passover, and they had to wait until it was over. So early on Sunday morning, they went to perform the ritual, but instead of finding a dead body, they received news of his rising. One would expect celebration, high fives among the women, raising the roof. But instead, we are told they were terrified. Again, that seems like a strange response to the news of resurrection. Of course, I shouldn't be too surprised. I recently heard about a woman who looked out her kitchen window to see her dog with her neighbor's rabbit in its mouth, shaking furiously. This was one of those bad neighbor relationships, and this was not going to help it. The woman grabbed her broom and she ran out, and threatening the dog within an inch of its life, she got the dog to let the rabbit go. She then picked up the rabbit by the end of the broom, and she saw it was too late. The rabbit was covered with dirt and dog spit. And that rabbit was very dead. She looked over at the neighbor's house and realized that the car was gone. So she had an idea. She carried that rabbit into her house. She threw it into the bathtub. She washed off all of the dirt and the dog spit. She even took the blow dryer to it. Got it all fluffed up and pretty. She climbed back over the neighbor's fence. She put it back into the pen and she shut the door, and then she snuck back home. A few hours later, she saw the neighbor's car pull into the driveway, and not long after that, she heard shrieks, loud shrieks coming from the neighbor's house. So the woman ran over to see if she could help. Feigning innocence, she asked, "Is something wrong? Is something wrong? Is it your rabbit?" The neighbor yelled, "Yes! Yes, it's my rabbit. 2 weeks ago, we buried it in the yard. It was dead. It's now come back to life. Come to think about it, fear might not be a bad response to something coming back to life. Of course, we know the rabbit wasn't resurrected. It had just been fluffed up a bit, but it was still very dead. Maybe you can relate to that. Being fluffed up on the outside. Now, I want to tell you that I watched you as you were coming in, and from where I stand, I have to tell you, you look pretty good today. Yeah, you do. I mean, I don't even know if you noticed, but if I raise my arms, I look like a rabbit. I dressed for the occasion, right? But we all look pretty good on the outside. And so just take a minute, if you will, and turn to your neighbor and check them out. And tell them, say, you look good. Now, I don't want to judge anybody. I don't want to judge anybody. But some of us look really good on the outside. We're all fluffed up on the outside because we're not really feeling very good on the inside. It's called image management. To make sure that you look really good on the outside because on the inside you really feel that there's a part of you that's dead. You feel an emptiness, a lack of hope, a lack of joy, a lack of peace, despite how you appear on the outside. Well, if that's the case for you, then you're in good company. Because the women who were going to the tomb that morning were not going to celebrate. The women who went to the tomb were not going looking for life. They were going to acknowledge death. They were simply going to carry out a religious duty. And maybe you can relate to that today. Maybe you're here on Easter Day because it feels like a religious duty. I mean, after all, it's Easter. And you're supposed to go to church, right? At least twice a year, Christmas and Easter. Or maybe you're here today to please somebody. Like your mother. And I'm just going to tell you, it's always a good thing to please your mother. But maybe you're here obliging somebody else's request. You're not looking for anything to change about your life. You're not looking for your life to change. You're just going through the motions. And if you can relate to that, you're in good company. That's right where the women were who went to the tomb that morning. And yet, I have to give them credit. They went. According to Mark's gospel, it wasn't then until they were on their way that they asked the question, who will roll away the stone? Mark says they had gotten all the anointing spices they needed prepared in advance. This was not something they did on a whim. And yet it was while they were on their way that they went, oh, yeah. Who will roll roll away the stone. And frankly, I find that odd as well. If we looked at the other versions, we would read that those who came to the tomb discovered that the tomb had been rolled away, but only Mark has the women asking the question. They went to all of this trouble preparing the spices to anoint the body, but on the way, one of them said, oh, wait. Who's going to roll away the stone? In other words, how are we going to get into the tomb to perform our religious duty? I mean, wouldn't you have thought that they would have asked that question earlier? Okay, that would be like showing up at the church on your wedding day. The wedding date is set. The officiant has been hired. The musicians have performed. The cake has been ordered. The flowers have been picked out. The reception hall has been reserved. And you get to the church on your wedding day, and then you go, oh, I guess I should have thought about my future spouse. Can you imagine? It was a huge deal not to remember that there was this stone that had been rolled in front of the tomb, which according to some estimates could have weighed between 1 and 2 tons. So we're talking thousands of pounds. That stone was a huge deal. The only thing I can figure is that these women were so overwhelmed with grief or sadness that they weren't thinking straight. Has that ever happened to you? Have you ever been knocked off your feet by some grief or sadness, some anxiety or fear to the extent that you can't think straight? If that has ever happened to you, then you know that during those times, even the simplest of tasks, like paying the bills, or doing your homework, or organizing, or planning, even eating, things that you used to do without much thought, things you used to do with ease, can get much more difficult. This might go on for days, weeks, even months. You try to develop a new normal, but there are even moments when you can barely even function. You walk around thinking, what is wrong with me? Why can't I just go on with living again? If that has ever happened to you, then you can relate to these women picking up their spices and going to perform a religious duty, and on the way realizing that there's this stone. Maybe you have felt that way. Maybe you feel that way even today. Maybe you've gone through something recently and you find yourself looking on this Easter day for something to get you going again, to help life go on, but you keep coming up against that stone that seems to be in the way. Maybe you've recently lost a loved one, or lost a job. Maybe you've had a relapse of some sort, or a breakup, and the very thing that once gave you identity, the very thing or person around which you built a life, if not a reputation, is now gone. So who are you now? You're trying just to go on, but again, every time you do, there's this stone. I will say this. At least the women went. You know, they could have started preparing the spices and then realized that they didn't know what to do with that stone in front of the tomb and just decided to go home and not go at all. But they went. And sometimes we can do that in our relationship with God. We say to God, God, if you will just move that stone, if you'll just fix this, if you'll just convince me that everything will work out as I hoped or planned, then I will pour out my heart to you. If you fix this for me, God, then I will go to church. Not just on Easter, but every time the doors are open. I will serve you. I will give to you. I'll do whatever. But the women show us that they discovered resurrection power as they walked in the direction of devotion. You know, there's a story that takes place in a little Austrian village during the time of Napoleon's reign. The story goes that when the army surrounded the village, the people panicked. So the town council was summoned because this was the second time in only a few short weeks that Napoleon's troops had attacked the village. Luckily, the first siege had failed, but this time the opposing forces were much stronger. The council debated back and forth if they should even try to resist or simply wave their white flag of surrender. Well, the next morning happened to be Easter Day. The people of the village gathered in the chapel. And the priest stood up and he said this, "Friends, we have counted on our own strength. And apparently that has failed. If this is the day of the Lord's resurrection, let us ring the bells. Let us have our service as usual and leave this matter in God's hands. We know only our own weakness. We do not know the power of God." When the priest finished, he looked around the parish, and people were saying, "Oh, yeah, I guess that's really all we can do. That's a pretty good idea." And they started ringing the bells. As they were doing this, Napoleon summoned his generals, and they debated what all of this bell ringing meant and concluded that it could only mean one thing, and that was that the Austrian army had come to offer relief. So, unwilling to risk their forces against those odds, the French officers ordered their troops to break camp, and the soldiers retreated. They retreated even before the church bells stopped ringing. When the village people came out of the church on Easter morning, the enemy was gone. The opposing forces were gone. Not because of their own strength, but the enemy was gone. Maybe you're in a place today. You're just trying to go on yourself, but every time you do, there's that huge stone. And maybe you're in a place today where you're not even sure if you believe this Easter thing. Actually, you're not sure if you ever did. You're also not sure you're also not sure that there is a God who can do anything about your obstacles, about that stone, that grief, that anxiety, that fear in your own life. But before God does anything, before God answers your prayer, I invite you to take a step of devotion, as the women did. Rather than focus on the problem, rather than focus on that stone, be devoted and see what God can do. Focus on what might open up in your life if you put your life in God's hands. Focus on what might be possible rather than focus on what seems like death. Because here's the takeaway for the day. You don't have to have it all figured out in advance. You don't have to have all of the answers. You don't have to put on a happy face when you come to church. You don't have to get all fluffed up, nor do you have to lead the Easter parade today. Sometimes faith is simply taking a step or two in God's direction. Sometimes faith is coming to worship, even when you don't feel like it, and saying a bullet prayer, something that I like to call a bullet prayer, like, Lord, help me. Sometimes faith is giving of yourselves, even when you're not sure or you still can trust God. Can we talk? Can we talk? All right, I'm going to talk to you, Madeline. Can we talk? That in itself has been good news for me through the years. Because believe it or not, even worship leaders struggle sometimes. I mean, we too have our grief, and we have our anxiety, and we have our fear, and sometimes we come, and the only thing that we can do is go through the motions of devotion and obedience. Sometimes all we can do is just take one step at a time, and then we're surprised. We're surprised when we discover that the stone has been rolled away. For some of us, Easter is not just something that we talk about, but Easter is something that happens even to us. One final thing. The women did not limit God by their expectations. The women did not limit God by their expectations. They didn't limit God by what they wanted. I mean, when the women got to the tomb, if they had discovered only that the stone had been rolled away and that they could get inside the tomb to take care of the body, they would have thought that was miracle enough. If they got there and the body of Jesus was still inside, they probably would have come out of the tomb and said, "Isn't God good?" That would have been enough. But God did even more. And sometimes we have to be open to God doing more, something different, something other than what we're asking for. None of it may be exactly what we hoped for. Sometimes, for instance, we think we know. We think we know what is best for us and what God wants for us. And sometimes we think we know what healing looks like. And most of the time, we assume that healing looks like keeping somebody alive at all costs, or keeping things exactly the same. Yet one day we're all going to die, aren't we? And we know that regardless of what we hope and try to maintain, to live is to change. That's part of God's plan. But it's not the end of God's plan. You know what's worse? You know what's worse than dying before we think we're ready? It's to die without ever really living. It's to die and never being free. Free from the fear of things not going as we hoped or planned. That is worse. Especially when we can live with the acceptance that the God of resurrection, the God of heaven and earth, lives beyond our expectations, and nothing at all can prevent the purposes of God from prevailing. When we have that trust and assurance, we can say to God, God, I want you to do this thing in my life, but ultimately, I trust in you, and I have peace, and I have acceptance in my life that no matter what happens, you're still going to love me, and I'm going to be okay. Do you have that? Do you have that? On this Easter day, whatever you're going through, whatever has happened to make your faith begin to falter, I invite you before trying to convince you of anything, just try to restore some simple acts of devotion and obedience in your life. And then be open to what God can and what God will do. Amen. 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 Amen.